My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. I'm sharing with you some thoughts on the comparison between Romans 8 and 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Romans 8 is talking about the resurrection. That's almost universally acknowledged, just like 1 Corinthians 15 is talking about resurrection. Well, in Romans chapter 8, Paul adds an element to that discussion, and that is that element, that tenet, if you please, of martyrdom and the promise of resurrection at the Parousia. Martyrdom and the promise of vindication, the promise of glorification, the promise of relief at the second coming. Paul placed that suffering in that first century context. I reckon that the suffering of this present time, that was Paul's present time 2,000 years ago, he said, is not worthy to be compared with the glory that is about to be revealed. Now, I've shared with you that this motif, this theme of suffering, first century suffering 2,000 years ago, in the context of the promise of imminent relief, imminent glorification at the second coming of Christ, as we commonly call it, is a dominant doctrine in the New Testament. I mean, I've got to tell you, once you begin looking at this doctrine, and by the way, in my book, Elijah Has Come, a solution to Romans 11, 25 to 27, I chronicle how pervasive this doctrine is just in the book of Romans. It is incredible. Well, anyway, in yesterday's video, I introduced to you another one of the many, many texts that develop this theme of martyrdom and suffering versus the promise of vindication and glorification at the imminent coming of the Lord. Paul was writing to the Thessalonian church, 2 Thessalonians 1, 2, and 3, that was alive 2,000 years ago. And he spoke and he used the present participial form of the Greek word thalipsis, which means pressure, to describe what was happening to them. He also used, by the way, another Greek word, pasko, which is never used, so far as I know, I may have missed something, but is never used of normal human suffering. It's not used, of financial difficulty. It's not used of cancer or heart attack or whatever. It's persecution for the cause of Christ, suffering for the cause of Christ. So Paul is writing to people 2,000 years ago to talk about what they were experiencing at that very time in their lives in the streets of Thessalonica. And he said, it is a righteous thing with God to repay with tribulation those who are troubling you. Now, here's something that is absolutely astounding. Paul said that at the coming of the Lord, Jesus would give the persecutors of the Thessalonians what the persecutors were giving the Thessalonians. The persecutors were troubling, thalipsis, the Thessalonians. When the Lord would come, the Lord would give the persecutors thalipsis. Well, let me tell you, it's pretty safe to say the persecutors of the Thessalonians were not sending the Thessalonians to hell. No, but they were persecuting them. Well, remarkably, point number one, it was the Jews doing the persecuting. During the Jewish war, the persecutors became the persecuted. But let's develop that just a little bit more, shall we? I was raised believing the 2 Thessalonians chapter 1 is about the end of time when Jesus comes and destroys the Roman Catholic Church and the Pope. I mean, after all, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, the man of sin, is supposedly, without doubt, some say, and I believed at one time, the man of sin is the Roman Catholic Pope. Well, here's the problem. Paul said it is a righteous thing to repay with tribulation those who are, that's present active indicative, those who are troubling you, those who are persecuting you right then, right there. Well, when did Paul write? 51, 52 AD. Well, guess what, folks? The Roman Catholic Church and the Roman Catholic Pope did not exist at the 51 or 52 AD. Did not exist. You know, if the Roman Catholic Church did not exist in 51 or 52, it's kind of tough for them to have been persecuting the Thessalonian church. Well, point number two. At a different time, I kind of changed my view and I said, well, yeah, Paul's talking about the Romans. The Romans were the key persecutors of the early church. Wrong. As N.T. Wright points out, everywhere we look in the New Testament, unless the evidence is totally misleading, it was the Jews invariably doing the persecution or actively instigating the persecution. Well, here's a fact. The Romans did not begin to persecute the church in the first century until Nero. Well, that was approximately 64 AD. That was a full decade after Paul wrote and after Paul said, it's a righteous thing with God to repay with tribulation those who are, present, active, indicative, those who are persecuting you. So, if it wasn't the Romans persecuting them, and it wasn't the Roman Catholic Church persecuting them, who was it? Well, you go to Acts chapter 17, and the way Paul preached, the Greek is very clear. The language, the translation is very clear. When the unbelieving Jews did not believe, they stirred up the nasty guys from the market and caused them to persecute the church. Who were the movers and the shakers? Who were the instigators of the persecution of the Thessalonian church? Unequivocally, undeniably, it was the Jews. And Paul said, it is a righteous thing with God to repay with tribulation those who are persecuting you. It was the Jews persecuting them. When the Jewish revolt began in 66 AD, those who were persecuting the church, i.e. the Jews, became the persecuted. And remember what Paul said. This would all take place at the coming of the Lord. And the Jews, as a persecuting power, as an organized persecuting power, were destroyed in AD 70. It's irrefutable. Hey, look, we've got more on this motif of martyrdom in the context of the promise of imminent, soon coming relief at the second coming, i.e., at the resurrection of 1 Corinthians chapter 15. So we will see you on the flip side.